Sometimes forgetting even the simplest of things out on the water can have grave consequences. Take for example, maybe you just forgot to attach that safety kill switch lanyard. Well, that can be the difference between you having a nice little swim out on the water and things going drastically wrong, kind of like we can see right here, and just like some of the things we'll see in this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. Our first story to make the boating news this week is going to take us down to the Dominican Republic, where this past week the captain on board the Norwegian cruise ship Escape decided his crew and passengers needed a little bit of sandbar time. This was the scene just outside of Puerto Plata in the Dominican Republic. As this Norwegian cruise ship was leaving port, strong winds drifted the vessel to the side of the channel where it became grounded with almost 4,600 people on board. The cause of the incident is claimed to be the 30+ knot winds the vessel was facing as it tried to leave port. Unfortunately, at the time of the grounding, the vessel had no choice but to wait overnight until high tide the next morning, when tugboats were able to get the vessel back off of the sandbar. The cruise vessel was forced to return to port for inspection to make sure there was no damage before being allowed to leave port again and set sail back on its cruise. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to a wild scene that occurred this past week in California, where this was the scene on Balboa Bay in Newport, California, where apparently somebody stole a 62-foot yacht and wound up crashing it into several vessels at a marina. As wild as the first part of this scene is, that's just the beginning. Somehow this captain, wannabe captain, winds up backing this vessel back off the docks and continues out into the bay, where he'll wind up colliding into another vessel and a seawall. Somehow still, one of the most wild parts of this incident, there were people on several of the vessels that he winds up colliding with, and fortunately somehow nobody comes out with any major injuries. The 38-year-old male who is driving the vessel is currently being detained by the Newport Beach Police Department. He's been booked on charges of grand theft of a boat and possession of a stolen boat, both of which are felonies, and he's being held with a $3 million bail. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us down to South America and down to southern Chile, where this was the scene this past week on a salmon farm when one of the feeding pontoons wound up catching fire. I actually get sent these stories from rural areas of South America all the time, and very rarely do they actually make the boating news because they're almost impossible to find any real information on. From the basics that I can find on this incident, it doesn't appear there was anybody on board the vessel at the time of the fire, but this scene right here is absolutely wild. They have people here trying to fight the blaze, but as they zoom in, it basically appears they're trying to fight this blaze with a garden hose. Now I do realize this hose is a little bigger than a garden hose, but it doesn't appear to have any real pressure behind it, and they're not really pumping all that much water onto the blaze. Once again, in this one I don't have a whole lot of information, but if you know anything about this incident, that's why I figured I'd share these images, because it was interesting, and if you know something more about it, write it up in the comments below and I'll pin your comment. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us back down to Florida, where this past week the Coast Guard wound up rescuing a 7-year-old passenger off the cruise ship Carnival Dream. The ship was approximately 264 miles southwest of Clearwater, Florida, when all of a sudden the 7-year-old passenger began experiencing abdominal pain. After members of the crew of the cruise line had a discussion with a surgeon from the Coast Guard, it was determined the child should be brought ashore. So a rescue helicopter crew was dispatched, and the child and her father were airlifted off the ship. They were taken to Johns Hopkins Children's Hospital, where it is reported she is in stable condition. Our next story to make the boating news is going to include the Coast Guard as well, and it's going to take us down to the Turks and Caicos, where U.S. Coast Guard crews wound up rescuing people who were stranded at sea for almost 3 days. The Royal Turks and Caicos Police Force Marine Unit reported to the Coast Guard that 3 people had departed on a fishing trip on Thursday aboard a 20-foot fishing vessel from West Caicos and unfortunately had not returned. The Coast Guard then went ahead and organized search and rescue missions around West Caicos, French Key, and Great Iguana Island in the Bahamas, where 3 days after this crew had departed on their fishing trip, they were finally found still floating on board their disabled 20-foot vessel. The U.S. Coast Guard rescue crew then hoisted the 3 fishermen on board the helicopter, where they were transported back to Provo, Turks and Caicos, and there were no injuries somehow reported in this incident, which is pretty impressive after being at sea for 3 days. But also, one of the things this really shows you is you always want to stay with your boat. A lot of times if a boat becomes disabled in a situation like this, we'll hear of people trying to leave the vessel, but the vessel's the most likely thing that's going to be seen and the most likely way for you to be rescued, as in this case right here. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening on your waterways, be sure to hit me up on Facebook or Instagram and let me know, and you might see your stories over here. Just like Dylan Eckhart, Pablo Beckdorf, Sean Olds, and Kai McCartney did this week. And if you haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button here.